In the tradition of Malcolm X, peace be unto you. I hear many people talking about the candidates that are preparing themselves to run for the office of President of the United States. And most of us have heard about these folks, these political opportunists. And Cory Baker is one of them. Kamala Harris is another one of them. And of course, they're going to even allow a African-American woman speak the response to Donald Trump, which has never happened before. Her name is Stacey Adams. Those folks are being put in front of us, of course, because the Democratic Party has become very masterful at manipulating a segment of the African-American community, particularly in the South, in the southern states, by using skin color, as they did with Barack Obama and Michelle Obama, to garner votes so that that gives their elite, who are no different fundamentally than the Republican elite, that will give them the edge in the upcoming presidential election. My position is don't bother with it. It's all circus. It's all manipulation. It's the media doing what it does for these agencies of power and concentrations of wealth, and that is to promote their propaganda. So I don't waste time dealing with that anymore. I don't follow these political party contests because, of course, the media presents them as a kind of football game, a kind of sport contest. And most of the politicians we know are funded by the super rich, the 1%ers in this nation. What I want to do in this short talk is present to you two problems that I think take priority over all of the political contest, over all of the political issues in the United States when it comes to what we, descendants of slaves, need done for us, exclusive of any other ethnic community. And there's hardly any other talk. I've done some talks on climate change, but there's hardly any talk by African Americans on YouTube, for instance, or any other platform about climate change. And it may be due to the fact that many African Americans just don't do science and they don't do math. And of course, that means that we oftentimes move around blind. We don't understand that there are greater changes taking place. The context of life itself on Earth is challenged now to a degree that it hasn't been challenged in 65 million years and at least 125,000 years. So let's look at problem number one, which is climate change. And if you just survey the last 3 or 4 years and all the damage that has been done to communities from Houston to California, Los Angeles, the San Francisco, Oakland Bay Area, if you just survey all the damage that has been done up to the polar vortex anomaly and the jet stream anomaly, which just occurred, you will see a pattern that the poor are suffering most of all. And on a larger scale in the future, we're going to see that increase. There will be more poor people suffering more. And of course, because most African Americans are poor, we're going to see their lives turned upside down and inside out by climate change. Now, I've put up the formula that I use for those of you that like to do the math. If you can't do the math, well, I'll just try to say a few things about what I did. I took the average global temperature, which stands today at about 14.6 degrees, and I projected what it will be in 10 to 12 years. And so you can see where I plugged in the data and did the basic calculations. And the answer I got was 16.4 degrees Celsius global average temperature in 10 years. But what I had to do was I had to add the annual rate of increase, 0.12 times 10. And what that did, as you can see here, is it increased the expected average global temperature to 2.8 degrees. That is important. And it's important because it's higher than the limit set by the United Nations panel on climate change, the International Panel on Climate Change that met in 2018. So we're talking about global average temperature that will be at least 2.8 degrees Celsius or 62 degrees Fahrenheit above what it is now. And that is significant. Now, based upon my calculation and recent research, CO2 in the atmosphere is expected to increase, meaning that there's not going to be an end to the acceleration of this global average temperature that is starting to cause havoc all over the world. Now, that will cause catastrophic climate change, and it will cause catastrophic climate change over the next 10 to 12 years. It already has started to do so, as I said, just within a week or two ago, the extreme cold caused by the breakdown of the polar vortex that's about 12 to 16 miles above the Earth, situated over the Arctic polar cap and the jet stream, which drives it. Now, we're not prepared for these extreme changes, and that in part is because of the increased dysfunction in our relations over the past 50 years. So we've been caught at a time when we are at our weakest, and at a time when there are many other intersecting lines of conflict in the United States and between the United States and other nations. And so we are in extreme jeopardy. We are at risk for a major reduction in our numbers if we do not remedy the immediate problems that are going to arise because of climate change. And you should not expect the federal government or state governments or county governments or city governments to provide the remedy for you or to mitigate it for you, because most of the politicians are controlled by the corporate complex, which has been fighting against the findings of the top scientists who have been doing research on climate change for decades and decades and decades. They are climate change deniers, and such as Donald Trump. And that, for me, makes me wonder whether there are African Americans who are climate change deniers. We're not getting conversation. We are not getting conversation from African Americans on the issue of climate change, except for me and maybe one or two other folks who are addressing this issue to the African American community. Instead, if you survey YouTube talk shows, what are they talking about? They're talking about idiots like Omar Johnson. They're talking about politics is the answer, which it is not. They're talking about frivolous religious issues that have to do with Bronze Age religious paradigms, which are completely erroneous, completely erroneous. And so there are millions of African Americans who spend their time, for instance, reading the King James Version of the Bible, and they really think that they're going to find the vision of God in that Bible, and they won't. They will not find the vision of God in the King James Version Bible. They will not find salvation in the King James Version of that Bible, but what they will find is that they will be up to their neck in seawater as sea level rise continues unabated, because they are not prepared. They are not prepared. Now, the second problem that I want to discuss with you is the problem that I've discussed many times before, and that is the problem or the challenge we face with regard to African and Caribbean immigrants and what is called the 80-20 rule. Let me first define the 80-20 rule. It is a rule that has to do with what is called the law of the creative minority. Now, that rule states that technological inventions and political and historical narratives come from about 20% of the population, and that roughly 80% of the population are conformists or lower caste conformists. So what that suggests is that, of course, most African Americans are just simply conformists. They're not critical thinkers. They're born and they fall in line and they walk the walk and talk the talk. The 20% of the population who are defining the intellectual landscape or mindscape of African Americans are white. They are white folks. Now, an economist named Pareto developed both concepts in the context of the distribution of income and wealth among populations everywhere. He saw the pattern. He saw it in nature. He saw it in society. Now, you don't have to be part of the 80%. You can be the 20%. But right now, the community of descendants of slaves is being challenged by a more vigorous community. Actually, there's 2 or 3 more vigorous communities. One is African and one is Caribbean. And it's not their fault. They're here to make a life for themselves. But they are competing with communities of descendants of slaves who are not competitive. And as a result, we're seeing those communities rise in terms of their income, in terms of their wealth, in terms of their education, in terms of their family integrity, in terms of their values, in terms of their cultural connections back in Africa and in the Caribbean, which are not severed. And as a consequence, descendants of slaves are being pushed down and are at risk of losing control of the narrative of people of African descent here in the United States. And if that continues, descendants of slaves will not have a voice at all in the United States. You can see that in cinema. More and more we see actors, top actors, who are either of Caribbean descent or of African descent, even if they're from England. And you can see that in many other arenas. I've told you before, and I'm going to tell you again, that many, if not now the majority, of African American students on university campuses, both state and non-state, in California, are either African immigrants or the children of African immigrants. Now, let's do some math. And my data is from the Pew Research Center and, of course, the United States Census Bureau. And what I'm saying is that a major demographic transfusion is occurring. We are literally being physically replaced. And it's happening in such a nuanced way that over the last 30 years, most of us have walked around and not really taken cognizance of the fact that populations are being transfused, populations are being changed, even though they appear to be the same. So here's the formula that I used. It demonstrates the population growth rate. And I did the math, started with, as you can see, in 2013, 3,793,000 African and Caribbean immigrants, as reported by the Pew Research Foundation. So with a given percent increase every year, I have calculated what to expect their population to be in 5 years, in 31 years, and in 81 years. So you can see for 5 years, the increase from 2013 to 2018 was approximately 193,480, for a total of approximately 3,956,481. Okay, so now we move from 2018, and let's project for 31 years. So you can see where I plugged in the data, did the calculations, and by 2050, we can expect the immigrant African and Caribbean population to be 5,163,410 million. Now that will be 8%, approximately 8%. It could be a point above that, it could be a point below that. Approximately 8% of the total U.S. African American population. Now notice, when you get up to close to 10%, you're getting closer to that 80-20 rule. That 80-20 rule. So let's look and see what happens in 81 years. So we're talking from 2013 to 2100, as you can see. And what the projected increase in the African immigrant and Caribbean population will be is approximately 8,492,080 individuals. So when we talk about a rate of change over 31 years, from 1980 to 2013, we're talking about 3.65%. Now, by 2050, approximately 15% of the African American population might be about 15%. And I say that because when African immigrants come or when Caribbean immigrants come, they start families, they have children, and they bring family members in with them. So there's going to be an increased rate of increase far beyond the rate that I have. We don't know. We don't know how many families are coming over. We don't know how many children are being born, because when you look at the census report, they don't break the communities down in that manner. They lump us all together. So my conclusion to you is that the 80-20 rule, which is called the law of the creative minority, may replace the narrative, the historical narrative that has grown over the past 300 years amongst descendants of slaves, and which has been the driver in some instances of social change, of policy changes, and of law that has made life better for millions, not only of African Americans who are descendants of slaves, but for Asian Americans and for Latinos. Let's just keep this in mind. The one group that has been responsible for lifting all boats for increased civil rights, increased quality of life, is the community of descendants of slaves. Our community has been the spearhead of social change. Now, isn't it ironic that all other groups, the Asian community, the Latino community, and now the African immigrant communities are doing better than descendants of slaves who broke the ice and made change possible? Isn't that ironic? Now, there are reasons for that, and they're complex, and they're numerous, and I don't have the time to identify them all in this talk. But if all that I've said is more true than not, and you can check the math, you can do your calculations, and you can let me know whether or not you have come up with a different conclusion. If all that is true more than it is not, what does it mean for descendants of slaves in relation to African and Caribbean immigrants in the United States? Because we are on the square. And if you're not doing anything to better your life, if you're not doing anything to increase the quality of your life, then look at the square. You're not competitive. And no one's going to cooperate with you. See the other corner? There are logical relations between the corners on the square. And no one will be compelled to accommodate you. And what all of that means is that if you can't fight, see conflict, if you can't fight or compete for a place on the square, it means that you're going to be eliminated. It is a kind of natural law. You will be eliminated, but you will suffer first. Now, I don't want to leave having said some things that may make you feel bad. I want to posit or propose some solutions that if you take to heart, you can use to change your life and those loved ones around you. First, the first solution that I'm suggesting is get a higher education or vocational training. Anyone who tells you don't go to college is an idiot, and they probably want to put their hand in your pocket. And I've heard many so-called African-American leaders say, don't waste your time going to college or don't waste your time going to vocational training. But listen, none of them have the resources to provide you with training or the kind of education in the sciences that you need. Not one of them. They don't have an employment office to give you a job. But what they do is that they ask you for donations so that they can live good off of your insecurities. The only person that can change you is you. Only you can take the action educationally and vocationally that's going to prepare you to be competitive on the square. Now, second, the second solution that I offer is get married. Get married, because two people working together, combining their resources, emotionally, intellectually, and economically, are better than one. Everybody knows that. How long have they known it? For over 350,000 years. And though you think that you're living an individualistic life, that life is inconsistent with the whole history of human life on this planet. Human life on this planet has been most successful when families are functional and work toward common goals to achieve them, competing on the square. Now, third, create families based upon equalitarian relations between husband and wife. In other words, if you get married, don't assume marriage is a hierarchy and that the male is the head of the household. No, it's the male and the female who are the heads of the household. And so therefore, we must break free of the Bronze Age hierarchical trap that we have been snared in. We have been snared in a Bronze Age and Iron Age hierarchical trap. The Bronze Age actually emerged by the exploitation, by the use of extortion on people who started doing agriculture 10,000 years ago. In other words, some people found that it was more beneficial for them to steal food from the farmers and extort from them than to be farmers themselves. And as a consequence of using tactics of violence, they constructed hierarchies of power and concentrations of wealth. And if you look at all of the historical hierarchies, who do you find at the bottom? You find the farmers and you find the slaves. And we are finally beginning to see light at the end of the tunnel that will free us from the grip of these hierarchical empires. And they're all over the world. Now, the fourth solution that I propose is that you operate your family as a small business, even if it's just you and your wife. Operate your family as a small business. The fifth solution that I propose, have at least 3 babies. Have at least 3 babies. The sixth solution that I propose, change your diet from junk food to a vegan diet and exclude alcohol and non-medicinal drugs. I hear people on YouTube exhorting you to have libations. That's idiocy. African American people are increasingly suffering diabetes. Alcohol metabolizes as sugar in your body, and it causes cancer. Anyone who's telling you to drink alcohol or who is a drunk, you need to separate from them immediately. And if you are married to someone who's a drunk or a drug addict, you need to file for divorce immediately and find you a woman or a man who is able to stay focused and not become addicted to these chemicals that will cause suffering to your family. Now, the seventh solution that I offer is work hard. Work hard to outcompete all others on the square. Remember, you are on the square. Work hard to be the best. That means get all the training that you can. That means learn all the skills that you can. And understand that when you compete successfully, you raise the quality of life for your family. Work hard. And maybe you cannot start where you want, start where you can, but with a goal or a vision in mind to raise yourself up as soon as possible along with your family. And work with your spouse to raise them up. Facilitate their education, facilitate their training, so that when you combine your resources, you raise the quality of your family at an accelerated rate. The eighth solution that I propose to you is save your money. Save your money only, underline, only for your family. No more tithing, no more giving money to people who paint pipe dreams for you. None of the scams. Save your money for your family, because your family consists of the only people who deserve it. They're the only people who deserve it. Now, the ninth solution. Base all your trust with others on mutually beneficial legal contracts with no exception. Even the church or mosque that you belong to must be based upon contractual relations. Do not spend 10 or 15 or 20 years tithing a church, and when you get sick, no one's there, or when someone dies in your family, there's no burial insurance. When you pay tithing, there should be a percentage of that comes back to your family in a time of need. And if you're in a church that won't do that or can't do that, leave it, because there's no benefit in it for you. And don't worry about the salvation of your soul. God takes care of that. You don't need a minister. You don't need an imam. You don't need a church. You don't need a masjid to be saved. All of the rituals mean nothing. Only God can save your soul. And God will meet you in your mind. God will meet you in your mind, not in a building. You may be in a building, but God will meet you in your mind. Understand that. That's where it happens. And that's where you get resurrected. That's where you get raised up into that intimate union with the divine. Now, the 10th solution, which I offer to you, is buy real estate. Once you and your wife can, buy real estate in communion with other families. If there's another family that's balanced and functional, enter into contractual arrangements to buy property together and grow equity in the property, and then turn it over together. And then take the proceeds and buy more property and continue growing real estate properties and enriching the families. If there's a third family, do the same. If there's a fourth family, do the same. If there's a fifth family, do the same. But don't go beyond 5 families. Because once you go beyond 5 families, you are putting yourself at risk for infiltration. So work with other families that are stable and that are willing to invest contractually in the purchase of real estate, grow equity, and then turn it over and repeat the process, just like a farmer growing crops. Look for the surplus and then grow more and grow your community. That is community. Communion with others who are willing to make a common investment and profit together and grow together. Those are 10 proposed solutions that I'm making to you that will enable you, if you apply them, to mitigate all of the damages that are going to result from the introduction of foreign people into this nation. And I'm not blaming them. What I'm pointing at is you've got to get going. You've got to get going and recognize that you're on the square and no one's going to give you anything. You're going to have to compete. You're going to have to fight. You're going to have to cooperate. And sometimes you will have to accommodate, especially with the members of your family. And if you don't understand that, you're just going to be a loser. And you should not be married to anyone, because you will be worthless and you will be a person who cannot contribute anything. And so that's the talk that I wanted to make with you today. My next talk will be on the family and marriage and abortion. And I'm going to touch on these issues because they are other priorities that we should be dealing with rather than thinking about Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, and the rest of these rogue politicians that are being used by the Democratic power elite. I am Dr. Stephen Nur Ahmed. And by the way, if you like the talk, give me a thumbs up. If you don't like it, write me and tell me. Let's talk about it. I am Dr. Stephen Nur Ahmed. Peace be unto you.